We're here to explore the relationship between theory and practice, as you've probably all read in the paper. The symposium leads from the premise that artworks can fall into the trap of illustrating, instrumentalizing, and often oversimplifying theoretical ideas and concepts. It explores new possibilities of how art reasons, how art thinks, and what a rationalist practice might be. It asks how art can expand rather than diminish thought. So we have here our speakers here in Newcastle are Amanda Beech from Cal Arts in California. Amanda is an artist and a writer and lives in Los Angeles. Her work has been featured in many exhibitions, amongst those After Hope in Beirut City Forum in 2015, Agitationism, the Irish Biennial, L'Avenir in the Montreal Biennial in 2014, and Speculative Aesthetics at Tate Britain in 2015. Beech's writing includes essays for the Anthologies of Speculative Aesthetics, published by Urbanomic Press in 2014, Realism, Materialism, Art by Sternberg Press in 2015, and catalogue contributions for the Irish and the Montreal Biennials. She's also published numerous artist books. Robin Mackay, am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm never
Mackay.
Quite sure. Mackay?
Mackay.
Mackay is the director of Urbanomic Press and has published a lot of, publishes the Journal of Collapse. He has translated a number of works for French philosophy, including Alain Badiou's Number and Numbers, and François Laurel's The Concept of Non-Photography and Anti-Badiou. And we also have online Bassam el Baroni. Bassam, where are you joining us from today?
From Alexandria.
From Alexandria. He has curated and co-curated projects and exhibitions in Murcia, Manifesta 8 in 2010, Madrid, Oslo, Bergen, Lofoten, and Limerick. He was co-founder and director of the now discontinued art space Alexandria Contemporary Arts Forum, and at present he's curating an exhibition for the Homework 7. Also joining us is Diane Bauer, who is an artist. Diane is currently involved in several ongoing collaborative projects, including Fixing the Future, Laboria, Cubonics and Xenofeminism, Real Flow, and most recently ASD, a project with 2 Miami architects. Her work has been screened and exhibited at Tate Britain, the Showroom, the Drawing Room, the Deste Foundation, the Mackay Museum, amongst many other spaces. From New York, Keith. Hello. Keith Tilford is an artist and writer living in Brooklyn. He primarily utilizes drawing, 3D modeling, and animation in his art. He is in the process of completing a graphic novel project, and his current research examines the convergences between art as a cognitive technology, the philosophy of scientific models, and the generalized transformation of concepts in modern systems of knowledge. He's co-organizer of Fixing the Future, along with Diane Bauer, Joshua Johnson, and Zoe Malik, and Mohamed Salemi. And from London, we have Suhail joining us from FILET. He is the co-director of the MFA Fine Art Goldsmiths, where he holds a readership in critical studies. Recent and forthcoming publications include On the Necessity of Art's Exit from Contemporary Art, The Ontology of Finance, Realism, Materialism, and Art, and Genealogies of Speculation, as well as The Flood of Rights. With this, I will hand over to Amanda, who will be giving her first presentation. Everybody is going to be talking for about 10 minutes, and then we will open it up to a response from Keith in New York, after which we will be taking questions from London, from you here in Newcastle, from London, and from New York.
Okay. Can everybody hear me in the audience here in Newcastle? First of all, yeah, great, thank you. I just don't know how loud to be. I just want to, first of all, do the the thank yous, really, which are absolutely necessary. First of all, I just want to thank the university for inviting me here as a visiting professor for a month, which is a 2-week stay right now, and then a 2-week stay in March, February, March, where we'll do another event kind of like this. And essentially to thank Uta here for managing that whole process, for getting me over, for organising the event tonight, and for doing such a great job in like hosting and making everyone feel really welcome and making this happen, basically. I'd just also like to thank the new Centre for Research and Practice, because they're a wonderful team to collaborate with, and they produce amazing online seminars and courses, and I just wanted to have this opportunity to work with them, but also to promote them as best I can, because I think it's an excellent resource and a really innovative platform for bringing people together to talk and think about art. So I'm really grateful for you guys to be here tonight as well, so thank you, and thanks to Sue Hale, of course, for doing the London version of the compare role in London. So I'm going to try and talk for about 10 minutes, and Luta's going to tell me off if I go too far, but maybe I'll just stretch it a bit. I think we're all going to go a little bit over, but we'll do our best, because we want a discussion. Okay, so the kind of premise of this whole business was to ask a really simple question, which is to think about art and thought and how art thinks, if indeed we could say that art thinks at all. And I just want to kind of lay that down before I even start what I've got to say, because we're constantly told that art thinks. And I'm not going to blame curators. My husband's a curator, so I can't do that. But you know, like you go into a gallery, any gallery, and there'll be a text panel or a bit of information, press release, the whole gallery system, the idea of talking and thinking about what we see is kind of, we have these modes of framing that that are part of the art world. So often when you read a text about what you see in the art gallery, you're kind of being told in that text how that art is thinking. And I think that we just need to kind of bear in mind that this is quite an obvious thing to say, but it's something to kind of bear in mind throughout this discussion. Perhaps the real bottom line experience of looking at art is never separated from both this idea that the artwork is thinking, but also the demand that it should be as well. So just want to say something like that to start with, but what I'm going to maybe try and propose here is both to describe how a lot of art thinks, or how it's been shown, how it shows itself to think, because thinking is often seen as a good thing, right? Let's just assume that. And then I might say something about how art ought to think. So I'm going to situate a kind of problem about how I see it to be thinking as it is, let's say. So how art is and how it ought to be is kind of essential to what I'm trying to do here. So I want to think about how art manifests itself, displays itself as a thinking practice. Now, of course, you could say there's tons of art in art history that is anti-thought, that's philistinistic, that says no to thinking. I'm not going to talk about that today because we've only got a few minutes. Let's just put that to one side, and I could unravel that later if you really want me to talk about all that stuff like affect and phenomenology, but I'm not, and sensation, but I'm not really going to go there that much. I'm going to talk about how art, a lot of artworks have proposed and displayed the fact that they are thinking things in the world. And I think this has been connected to this idea that an artwork should be propositional. So this means that art can propose new ideas in its form and material presence. So I'm just thinking of a propositional quality as being very simple, but art has proposed itself as a thinking or critical practice if it proposes new forms and new ideas, if it makes us think. So what I'm wondering about or reflecting upon is how a thinking practice, we've understood what that means very often when an art practice is sought to explain to us something about how things work in the world. So it might explain the structures that constitute power by revealing them to us So what we might take as ordinary is made unfamiliar. What we think of as natural is revealed as constructed or artificial. And these sites become the space for a skeptical inquiry by art. We see a suspicion by art of how things are, and a kind of explanation of how things are and our plight within them. So this idea of revealing the truth of the real situation of things underneath the kind of artificial world that we live in. So there's a kind of set of practices that are very interested in that. And I would say that they share this idea of being anti-realist. And I think that we can say that there's a modern and a postmodern forms of anti-realism. And I could easily list heaps of artists that do this. I could think of Brecht, Naumann, for example. And I think in general, I could say that modern anti-realist art reveals power in the particular or local to talk about the general, and postmodern anti-realist talks about the general and the universal through language games in the local or the particular. And I think both describe this idea of the human as being caught in the throes of ubiquitous power. The work describes a state of the human caught in the present, and this is a universal quality. So just for example, Beckett's Waiting for Godot is a play about the human caught in the ubiquitous power of infinite time that it can never know. So there's this idea that I know that I will never know. So it's a kind of tragic condition of the human, and the artwork or play explains that or extrapolates it through time, duration. So this kind of art explains the plight of us in the context of how things are, and by doing so it leaves a space of potentiality open, and this is located in the experience of the work itself. So what I'm trying to think about is how the work that I'm thinking of, it has this idea that art should be ruleless or free, and it's really important to this art that it can be interpreted in all kinds of ways by the free reader. It is this openness to the future where this art is supposed to have a propositional quality. So it's not propositional because it commits to specific things or claims, but it's propositional by the very fact that anyone can say anything about it. There's that kind of anything, whatever. I'm not going to do the whatevs kind of thing, but there's kind of idea that it can be read in so many ways, and that's the propositional moment, or the feeling that it can have propositional quality. So it's a kind of bet or a wager, but also a belief that art has a natural space where it occupies a natural space. It is a natural thing that produces a multiplicity of interpretations, and therefore it harnesses this idea of being propositional but also often political. So the gatekeeper art, it's a gatekeeper for different futures. But as I said, this future is never directed. And I'm worried about that because it means that the future is kind of banal, because it's always the arbitrary or whatever. It's never determined or decided upon or committed to in any particular way. Because the work's so interested in explaining the conditions of our universal plight within the present and the historical moment of human nature. So it kind of perpetuates the status quo. And also, this artwork is constantly speaking about its own limits. It's a kind of self-explanatory art. It's the idea of having a propositional practice is to divest itself of representational qualities to reveal some truth or other. So often this work is trying to escape representation to tell a truth. So it might say, I'm artificial, I'm just an image, and I know it. So it's kind of got this self-deprecating, maybe false humility about it. So by doing this, art becomes a practice of an internally directed self-explication that assumes it's free from representation and then goes and does it anyway. So just to finish, I'm going to try and give you some examples about the artwork I'm talking about, and maybe to think about this another way. And I'm not going to go into detail with this, but there's a a philosopher of language, analytical philosopher called Robert Brandom, and he talks about a distinction between sapience and sentience, which is essentially this distinction between the animal and the human. And he also talks about the difference between representational and propositional languages. And the only reason I'm mentioning him is because he gives quite an easy example of what representational language is, and he talks about how a map works. And a map is something we use to get to places, and it's kind of functional, and we don't kind of normally like inquire. The map doesn't kind of speak about itself in any particular way or anything else. So it's got a representational basic use function. But what I was thinking about when I thought about my experience in the art world, and I'm going to tell you like a little anecdote if I've got time. I was at a talk, an artist talk. I'm not going to tell you who it was or anything. It's not important. But somebody was showing me like a picture of Google Earth. And they were going over Google Earth and saying, this is Google Earth. Look at all the land on the freeways and the mountains. And then they were very excited because they could find a bit where Google Earth seemed to break. And the freeways went all wonky and went all funny. And they were saying that that point is critical. Like it's a moment where we start thinking because the thing's broken. It becomes apparently something else. But I was really suspicious of this because I was thinking, well, the map continues to be a map. Google Earth hasn't come crashing down. Nothing's really changed. And to say that the map, if that break, those pixels, the wonky freeways, if all they're doing is reminding me that Google Earth is a map, that's pretty minimal thinking. So just to say a map is a map, well, I'd expect a bit more thought to happen if that's called critical art or thinking art. So there's a lot of kind of glitch art that's very interested in saying, here's a system and you just use it and work through it, and then, oh, look, it's broken, and therefore it tells you what it is. It tells you it's artificial and not real. So I've got a kind of suspicion that whilst that has some propositional content, there's something going on there because there's a kind of reflection on the conditions of its own structure. I would say it's minimally propositional, and there's a kind of problem there because that art is claimed that wants to be propositional. That kind of art that does that, it says it's propositional, but I don't think it is. So I think there's a kind of contradiction going on in that kind of work. So I'm going to kind of finish now because Uta's looking at me, and I guess I want to say that I've just had time to kind of make a complaint, really, to say that there's a lot of art that wanted to think about its commitment to doing something or having some agency or making us think differently. But I think a lot of art, in claiming that and divesting itself of its representational qualities, it problematically, all it can do is talk about itself and just say, I am art and I'm not good enough. And so there's this kind of self it's kind of like a Judeo-Christian kind of like, I'm terrible, like I feel guilty. It's like a guilt-ridden art that wants to kind of suppress itself all the time, rather than actually make extensional kind of commitments to saying, well, I'm going to think about actually reaching out and going somewhere. It's constantly mirroring, it's explaining itself, and therefore all of this talk about being propositional and making these commitments, I find it kind of null and void, and it produces a kind of naive practice. So maybe we can talk about and open these ideas up as we go, I'm sure, but I think I'm going to end it there. But I could do heaps of other examples, but I'm not going to. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Amanda, for this very concise narrative of laying out the problematics around thinking through practice. And I will hand over to Diane.
Okay. First of all, thanks very much for the invite. It's great to be here. I generally doing talks, I don't like to read things out, but because of the short time, I've written something and I'm just going to read it straight, so I apologize for the stiffness of it. So to start, the question of how art thinks, you can all hear me, yes? Yeah. I actually don't know that art itself does think. I think humans think, and we make up an ecology, a field where there is thinking that happens. The difference between the kind of thinking involved in making and the kind of thinking involved in viewing, speaking about, or making sense of art is there's an essential difference. So in the studio, there's a range of types of thinking involved. And to name just a few, there's that stage when you begin and you're feeling all over the place in the dark.
Sorry, can I interrupt? This is London calling. We can't hear you very well. Can you move the microphone nearer to you?
Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. So just to speak again about the various kinds of thinking that happens within a studio practice, there's a kind of flailing about in the dark where you don't know what you're doing and you're feeling around to see what turns you on, what seems exciting, what's worth working with. And it's a kind of thinking where ideas are started and aborted and restarted and often abandoned altogether. It's miasmatic, nonlinear, and a non-directed kind of thinking. Then in other kinds of practices, or maybe the same kinds, there's a kind of thinking that's closer to engineering. So questions like what materials will work best, how does this thing stand up and not kill someone, what kind of budget do I have and what can I do within that budget. And there's of course conceptual thinking. What am I doing with regard to meaning, how is it going to be read, what do I want it to be doing, and do these things match up? And importantly, when they don't, what do you do then? At that point, you can turn to the abort, or you can be sent off in all sorts of new directions that you wouldn't have found otherwise, which can also be very productive. I find that within an arc of a project, there's a transformation in the kind of thinking that happens, starting at a certain level of indulgence and following your nose, leading to the need to hone things and hone the thinking, excuse me, into something much more rigorous as the project develops and nears completion. Now, this is all rather obvious, I think, to anyone that has spent any time in the studio, and probably not the most interesting way to speak about arts thinking, but it seems important for me to lay out the very workaday foundation of arts thinking from the perspective of production. So to start, Suha Malik, who's our respondent in London, speaks about contemporary art as a genre and the need to exit it. By this, I understand him to be speaking about contemporary art as a field rather than a series of discrete art objects. And it is this field that I'll be referring to. Artists, when they produce, are, though, an important part of this field. We are part of a wider ecology. There are many reasons to deride this field and the fuzzy thinking that is often justified in its name, but I'm not going to go there for the moment, preferring to focus on how and where this ecology can be useful and useful for what. My ambition for what art is, and perhaps more importantly what its ecology can do, is covered by the following questions. Can art assist in our capacity to know things about ourselves and the universe and that other disciplines cannot? Can art affect the world in ways that other disciplines cannot? And there's often a discrepancy between what art claims it's up to and how it really functions in the world, between its claims on politics and the reality of its politics. Can we develop an art that's more consistent to its claims and to a politics that one could avow from the position of the left? One area where I think art can perhaps gain superior leverage beyond its own self-referential discourse is its tendency towards transdisciplinarity. It seems that people working in a range of fields, and importantly people working on the edge of their fields, from science to philosophy to political economy, that may hit resistance within their own disciplines due to entrenched canon or general conservatism, can often find a place to try out ideas within the field of art. In fact, I think urbanomic is the fact that they find a substantial part of their audience within an art context in many ways a good example of this. This is indeed how the field of work thinks when it's going well. This is not to say that content and thinking need to come from outside the field of art, but this cross-pollination, I would argue, is definitional of what art is now at its best. So artists, as makers, participate in this ecology, and the thinking they do is served better when they are part of it and not necessarily the stars of the show. As artists, we think, we have ideas, we work through them in ways that are often but not always produce material stuff. But the actual thinking functions in a world, outside the self-referential discourse is the art ecology that we are part of, and not the discrete objects in and of themselves. This is not to say that art objects in whatever form are no longer relevant, more that they are just something, not the whole thing. I would argue that artists, those of us that make stuff and play a large part in defining what art is, not exclusively, but at least part, should start to think more systemically, to make deliberate moves on this ecology. We need to understand what art is now for, what we want it to be for, and work in a deliberate way towards that. How am I doing in time? Yeah. When I began writing this and trying to shrink it all into 10 minutes, the question of how do I get those questions that I actually spend a lot of time in the studio thinking about into the ecology and indeed into this talk. I think there's a good deal of overlap between those of us on the panel, and I suspect that my co-panelists may have a better way of integrating these things. But I'm going to go with the more car crash technique of just throwing them in. So to wildly summarize, the research and indeed the thinking that has been preoccupying me in the studio has been dealing with the question of time and the question of its existence as a real thing independent from the human and the phenomenology of it for the human. For this, I'm looking at physicist Lee Smolin, who argues that time is indeed a real thing in the universe, independent from human perception of it, which does not concur with most of 20th century physics, by the way. But the question this leads me to is, given that we understand the universe via our biology, what sort of prejudices exist when trying to understand time, given our own finitude and phenomenological relationship to time? Here I'm looking to philosopher Thomas Metzinger, who speaks about consciousness through a materialist lens of cognitive neuroscience. Now, I think some others might mention Metzinger, or at least might have something to say as a subject of arts thinking, so I'm curious to see if maybe during discussion we can hash some of this out. But the question, nature of time, there are all sorts of questions that preoccupy me. The puzzle for me is why do I consistently find science and philosophy much more compelling as a research topic than art itself? Part of this indeed could be the romanticization of fields that are not mine, and I'm sure that that's in the mix. But this got me to thinking to what sorts of knowledge are produced in science and philosophy, and how does it contrast to the sorts of knowledge that tend to be valorized in the field of art? And why do I find one more urgent than the other? I do not think there's a difference in kind in the sort of thinking that happens when doing the physics that Smolin does or the philosophy that Metzinger does than the kind of thinking that happens in the studio. They all take huge leaps of imagination and wild speculation, much of which undoubtedly ends up in the bin. But the knowledge that this is produced, the knowledge that this sort of thinking produces, results in thinking in most cases is of a different kind. Smolin and Metzinger are trying to define a knowledge that can be described as a broad truth. I'm reluctant to use the word universal, but it may indeed be appropriate here, I'm not sure, rather than a truth that exists for individual subjectivities, which is more often the case in art practices. So when Smolin speaks about time existing, he's not talking about time's existence for him, or even with Metzinger, who's dealing with consciousness, he's not speaking about an individual's experience of a now, but the nature of a now for the human subject. A now exists for the human as an organism, rather than a now that exists specifically for Metzinger as an individual subjectivity. So thinking about thinking, being it art or science or philosophy, I'm not sure there's a difference in kind. Imaginative leaps are essential in all three. Lots of absorbed ideas are also lots of aborted ideas are also necessary. I'm not advocating failure here. I just want to be realistic about the process. The disciplines each have their own specialist language, which results in thinking that is made manifest. But perhaps because of a historical romanticization of what the artist is, we may seem to be able to get away with all sorts of things that would not fly in any other discipline. There's a lack of rigor within the field of art, which means that much of what gets produced is often a manifestation of all sorts of navel-gazing glorified as cultural production. So just because it's art's current tendency, the sort of knowledge that is produced is often subjective in nature. This does not mean that art is not able to produce knowledge beyond the subjective. It can and it should. One way to do this is to move from a tendency to focus on the individual artist and move to the production of art and its thinking to more deliberate systemic interventions. This does not disqualify discrete art objects, but it does reduce their status as part of an ecology rather than the stars of the show. This is not something to be mourned. It can perhaps even liberate individual art practices from having to carry the weight of having to do it all, recognizing that the ambitions we rightly have for what art is and does can be spread out and met by the larger ecology as a collaborative effort. I thought I would finish here. I have one more thing to say. I realize with writing the final sentence that you may be left with the idea that I'm letting artists off the hook to go back and get on with making whatever they like, and deferring responsibility to the field at large. And that would be a shame, because that is really not what I mean. As I think I've made clear, art and artists are part of a larger ecology, but it's the responsibility of artists as producers to define the direction of this ecology. Some essential thing needs to happen about what we want art to be, what we want it to do now, what our commitments are, and if our practice is consistent with the answers we get to those questions. I am advocating an art that is systemic rather than individual thinkers. This is a shift that needs to be made, and it's contrary to many of the habits we have been taught about what we are and what we could be. Could be a very useful strategy for redefining what art could be or could become. And that's, should I do it in 10?
Even a little bit, 12.
Okay, 12.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant, Diane. I would now like to hand over to Bassam. I don't know whether we need to turn this off or not. Bassam, maybe Tony, would you be able to unmute Bassam?
Yes. 1 second. Oh, he's unmuted now. Or no, he is muted. Can you unmute yourself, Bassam? Because it's not letting me do it. No. Hold on. Let me try it. For me, it says, yeah. So no, still nothing. Do you know where the mute button is on your? Are you using an iPad right now? Yes, there you go.
Okay. So
Great.
you can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm going to try and compress a lot of ideas into the 10 or so. Basically, following up on what Diane was saying, and also with some links with what Amanda was saying. For those of you not familiar with Metzinger, his main idea is that the idea of the phenomenal self model, which is a bit like an ongoing process of flocking and chunking clusters of information to constitute a self. It's the idea that there's no such thing as a self, but the self is actually a process. And he says we become conscious when our brains, quote, successfully pursue the ingenious strategy of creating a unified and dynamic inner portrait of reality. Our brains generate a world simulation so perfect that we do not recognize it as an image in our minds. Then they generate an inner image of ourselves as a whole. So this inner internal holistic image of oneself is what he calls the phenomenal self model. But there are two very important metaphors that Metzinger uses, transparency and opacity. The point that Metzinger implies is that we're unable to be aware of our self-models as models. We can access the data, i.e. the content that constitutes the model, that is ourself, but we can't detect the medium that facilitates the process of self-constitution. He gives the example, which is, we do not see the window, but only the bird flying by. We do not see neurons firing away in our brain, but only what they represent for us. Briefly put, this is what transparency is, or what Metzinger means by transparency, which means only having access to the content of our phenomenal states, or in other words, ourselves. He makes the point that while humans share the condition of transparency with many other animals, most other animals have an entirely transparent model of reality, meaning that they only have direct and unequivocal access to the content of themselves, but are unable to produce any distance to that content. Because, quote, this process of representing while you know that you're representing hasn't yet started. It's not running on these animals yet. This latter process of representing while you're knowing you're representing, or understanding processed information as processed, is what Metzinger calls opacity. So it's kind of counter intuitive in a sense to how we would normally understand opacity and transparency. We can catch ourselves in the act of knowing, other animals cannot. And this catching is opacity. And it's the property which philosopher Ray Brassier pointed out in an interview with Metzinger published online. It's the property that distinguishes thinking from mere consciousness. In other words, the capacity to represent your own representations. So just to sum up very quickly, the main point about Metzinger that I want to make, and then to link it to the later part of this very quick talk. What Metzinger brings to light is the very real bifurcation or splitting of selfhood as co-presence of both transparency and reality. Because transparency and opacity. So he brings to light this very real bifurcation of, or splitting of selfhood as co-presence of both transparency and opacity, but also as a co-presence of knowing through evidence that you do not have a locatable unified core called the self on the one hand, and having to nonetheless automatically generate a self to function in everyday life on the other. The point is that these facts should not be taken as a contradiction that can then be turned into some kind of dialectical resolution, which attempts a synthesis or a reconciliation between what we know to be our true neurologically generated selves and the self-constituting narratives that are ourselves in social interaction. So, and then he has a concept that he hasn't quite developed to a great degree, which is his concept of intellectual honesty, which I think for me is quite important in how to look into this question of how art ought to think. For Metzinger, intellectual honesty is basically the recasting of knowledge from the position of being no one, scientifically speaking, i.e. not having a self, and having to be someone, socially speaking. This is a reality that has given up on the classical utopian game and any notion of an ideal real, which is a pivotal notion that Amanda mentioned earlier, and also Sohail Malik talks about extensively in his exit from contemporary art thesis. So through Metzinger, based on these Metzingerian terminologies, art today, as an expanded and diversified field, despite its diversity and its great expansion, can still be understood as a recurrent and unsettled encounter between a peculiar human desire for transparency and the human tendency towards the opaque. So the roots of this problem of the ideal real. The roots of the problem is one can think about it historically very quickly, hopefully filling up the holes in the discussion later. For me, I think the roots have a link to the distinction, or historically speaking, to a distinction between art and its emergence or splintering from the artisanal. So art as an evolution towards the opaque, if you like. So the roots of the problem can be simply a kind of term put as reality is not equal to transparency alone. Reality is both transparency and opacity, the co-presence of them both. And the tendency in art, like if you want to kind of, if we want to kind of reference Amanda's example earlier of the Google Maps image, is that reality is somehow reality is somehow understood as transparency. Transparency is understood as a kind of condition or a state of freedom. Reality is a state of freedom, which is a state of transparency, a state of non-opacity. And the real is then equated with is equated with a kind of non-artificial thought. So it's kind of like the Heideggerian distinction between the human nature as something that is, you could say, transparent in this case, and between the human condition, which is man-made, but also artificial. So art is always trying to reach through this misunderstanding of reality as a kind of a transparent condition, and not a bifurcated co-presence of transparency and opacity. It's always trying to reach this non-artificial transparent condition, which is kind of strange. And of course, in art history, we have examples of a kind of reality as that transparent condition. You could say, for example, Jackson Pollock and action painting as a kind of transparent kind of reality. How am I doing in time? Do I have a couple of more minutes, or do I have a couple of more minutes?
Right now they're muted, so they might be speaking to you, trying to speak to you, but they're...
Okay.
Let's say
A couple of minutes.
2 minutes. 2 minutes. Can you see?
Oh, okay. 2 minutes. Okay. So to kind of round up. So I very quickly I just to kind of think of this problem. When it comes from the transition from artisanal crafts, and something that happens with composition in this transition from you could say the craft, the artist as a craftsperson, transmuting into an artist, which was a kind of institutional process. Art historian Marina Berlorskaya, in her book Luxury Arts of the Renaissance in 2005, she points out to the Academy of Drawing, established in 1563, as the point where artists or artisans at the time drew a wedge between themselves and other crafts to kind of in a sense transcend into this moment of the institutionalization of opacity, in which art becomes a thinking medium, and distincts itself or splinters itself from the unintellectualism of, if you like, manual labor. So it's also this playing into this historic mode or historic kind of distinction between the laborer and between the artist as an intellectual thinker. But you could say the moment of maximum opacity is the Duchampian moment. And this is the moment where art reaches its maximum opacity. But then we can move on to finally Sohail's, and I'm very happy to have him today to kind of comment later. Sohail's take on this idea of what he calls the anarcho-realist condition of contemporary practice, which is a kind of combination of anarchist attitude and realist viewpoint. And this anarcho-realism is basically formulated as a position against the temptations of what is considered art's inherent artificiality. This can be understood, generally speaking, in Malik's formulation, quote, art as we have it, actually existing art, is but a shortcoming of what art should be, unquote. And of course, Sohail also says that art's reality, in fact, is, quote, a cultural and ordered practice, not spontaneous, expressive, or autonomous, unquote. Therefore, Malik's position, re-artificiality, on this point, is that art should fully declare its artificiality, making its artificiality its real without recourse to an idealized real. And then we can identify, and this is the last paragraph that I'm going to be pointing out, we can identify the idealized real that haunts contemporary art as nothing but a confusion between transparency, or the condition of only having access to the content of our phenomenal states, and the real. It is the misconception of transparency alone as reality, while in fact reality is constructed as a bifurcated co-presence of transparency, consciousness, and opacity, thought, i.e. access to processed information as processed. Contemporary art becomes the arena in which both the artist and the viewer catch themselves, especially in this extended Duchampian model of contemporary practice, catch themselves in the act of thinking, but at the risk of remaining in a loop of full opacity and entrapment in the representation of the act of capturing themselves in the act of thinking. This recurrent mechanism disenables the co-present reality of transparency, a consciousness as an invisible window medium, and this enabling returns back to art as a lack of transparency, misunderstood and gestured and or represented as the unattainability of the real. This is the idealized real that manifests itself as skepticism.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can see it via Skype, but there was a lot of nodding going on during your paper.
Okay.
So I will now hand over to Robin.
Thanks. I'm also a little bit nervous about the 10-minute time limit, so I might have to excise chunks of this. So if it's a little staccato, then you'll know why.
Yannick, can you hear?
Continuing from,
Yes.
I think Amanda hinted at a distinction between two types of propositionality, which I just want to kind of clarify, a negative and a positive sense of the propositional in art. And I think the propositional, the good sense, if you like, was that a propositional work would be a work that made a statement that had some strong claim to correspond to the real and to be saying something about the real, and thereby in some sense called for action or called for a commitment on the part of the viewer. Now my problem with this is that I can't imagine as anything other than dismal an artwork that aims only to elicit commitment to some proposition. I think we've all encountered artworks that primarily function to make a point. They're eminently forgettable. They reliably draw the cognitive gaze toward a proposition, and their only claim to art as such lies in a kind of coquettish withholding of explicitation. That is, they're holding back from simply saying what they want to say. So faced with works like this, which are essentially a kind of ingenious illustration, yes, we certainly, or I certainly tend to think, just stop wasting my time and tell me what you want to say. But it would be rather perverse to formulate on the basis of that irritation program for what art could or should be. On the other hand, some work clearly hopes to awaken a set of feelings that are intractable to rational thought and to any kind being formulated in any kind of proposition. This then seems to consign the artwork to an autonomy, and a kind of autistic autonomy, where its value is that of an exemplary exception, i.e. a reminder in a world stultified by rationalization that there's something else, a kind of indistinct hope. When it doesn't collapse onto one of them, contemporary art seems to be trapped between these two poles. It insists on its agency in the world and its effective, if subtle, elicitation of some kind of commitment from its viewers, but then it's also keen to disavow any direct, intentional, causal, rhetorical, or pragmatic impact or action. So acknowledging the bankruptcy of these kind of residual conceptual tropes which tend towards the illustrative, and the notion of complete ineffability of the material of art as a kind of unsayable real, I would still like to insist, and I think this is something that Diane also hinted at, that the practice of the making of images in the broadest sense entails a non-discursive thinking, a thinking with rather than about or signified through the materials, a thinking that's asymmetrically related rather than opposed to discursive thinking. And I want to discuss this by way of a kind of parable from the history of painting. And I'm very conscious that this is going to seem anachronistic. It's drawn from Eric Allier's book, The Brain Eye, subtitled New Histories of Modern Painting. And I've spent 2 years translating this book, so that's why it's in my head, and that's why I'm going to talk about it. In 1832, the painter Delacroix made a trip to Morocco, which was pivotal for the development of his practice. And as Alliers argues, on the evidence of Delacroix's diary, his journal, we can see that what impressed itself most intensely on Delacroix was the light and the intense colours, and in particular, it was the non-figurative use of colour, the use of complementary colours to heighten and intensify each other in fabrics, clothing, and decor that really had an impact on the way that Delacroix painted on his return. Delacroix would go on to explode the order of academic painting from within, with works where the viewer participates in the perceptual synthesis of the image from a complex of relations of colours, rather than, as in the then conventional academic model, appreciating the faithful representation of recognisable figures with colour employed as a secondary support for the production of neoclassical beauty, i.e. local colour filling in the outline that describes form in a harmonious imitation of nature. So in Delacroix, the outline progressively disappears completely, leaving no form, but with the image now being assembled dynamically in the eye of the viewer through the interplay of the forces of mutually intensifying assemblages of colour. Now, almost in parallel, in 1839, Michel-Eugène Chevreul publishes what would become a famous textbook on complementary colour contrast. As an industrial chemist at the Gobelin tapestry factory, Chevreul had been asked to investigate the problem of the stability of certain colours, and ended up concluding that it was not the dyes that were at fault, but the effects produced by differences between neighbouring colours, which tended to either intensify or attenuate each other. So Chevreul, like Delacroix, discovers as his object of study the virtuality of colour relations, which he then goes on to attempt to formulate according to mathematical laws, which can be articulated with the Newtonian physicalist account of colour. So what's interesting is that although Delacroix certainly did come to know of Chevreul's work, Delacroix's own research into colour complementarity didn't come from an application of this theory, but from his prior encounter with an outside of painting that led him to discover and explore within painting colour effects that exceed the gamut of normal perception and the function of faithful representation, and would create an unprecedented mobilization of the visual as such. So Delacroix creates distributions of sensation that open up the experience of the painted image to the virtualities of colour that had always worked it from within, but which the form and ratio of painting had controlled and suppressed. For his part, Chevroy sounded a note of caution on this point. He actually said the application of these effects of complementarity in painting would be a huge mistake because it would risk leading to an overcharged effect that would undermine representation. So reinforcing the disciplinary boundaries that Delacroix is in the process of blurring, Chevroy insists that the application of the principle of colour complementarity should be confined to the decorative arts, whose appeal is to the eye alone, rather than to recognition through judicious form and description, and that painters, in fact, should try to counteract these effects wherever possible. On the other hand, we also know very well that Delacroix himself, in his journal, did in fact work intensively, continually towards a theoretical grasp of colour. But what's evident is that this thinking emerged in and from the process, from the practice itself, and then fed back onto it. So the practice and the theory were continually spurring each other on. And Delacroix's theory, the concerns of Delacroix's theory are not those of Chevroy, who aims to propose a solution to a particular problem and aspires to anchor the sensory experience of colour in a mathematico-physical system, which therefore is constrained to exclude the part of the viewer. So it's obvious enough then that there's a complex and discontinuous relation between the sequence of the artist encounter, drawing out of a virtuality, experimental exploration, explosion of conventional form. So I think the last thing I was saying was just this kind of this story, which concerns the theorists of Neo-Impressionism, who then come to understand what they call the new painting as an implementation of Chevroy's scientific principles, and Delacroix as the pioneer of this supposedly scientific use of colour, so that painters then begin to be judged by their application of the precepts of this supposed scientific theory. So there's a discursive concretion of a set of propositions about painting, which now actually occlude the individual researchers of the painters themselves. So painting is reduced to a kind of propositional state by criticism and historicization. And I think this connects in a sense to what Amanda was saying about the predominance of interpretation and text in the gallery and so on. Okay, so that's the parable is over, and now this is the actual sermon. Because obviously it's not easy to see what these twists and turns of this, what is a pre-Duchampian story, might have to offer a thinking of contemporary art insofar as the expanded field, which is now formless, which now no longer has an outside or is composed of a plurality of outsides, even though it's still obsessed with escape. But I do think, I think there's some things we can draw out of this are germane to, let's say, for want of a better word, speculative art practices, which select and assemble materials in such a way as to solicit the viewer's participation in the diagrammatic projection of an idea, the exposition of a virtuality that the artist has sensed, has encountered in a particular situation or situations. The Delacroix-Chevroy relation is informative, but we could just as easily perhaps talk about the story of Debussy's encounter with the gamelan, which leads to the explosion of Western tonality, or any number of other similar stories. And I'm going to say here, in case it comes up later, there's also a question of Orientalism in the two examples I've used, but it also problematizes the notion of Orientalism, I would say. More recently in literature, take Ballard's encounter with advertising materials, medical textbooks, that give him this foreboding sense of the incursion into mass culture of a complex of technology, celebrity, death, sexuality, and twisted metal, and lead him to actualize and magnify this within the space of the novel, in the process mangling the form itself, and producing what I don't think anyone would call a useful book. If we look at Amanda's works, the materials of the video works and the way they're assembled, montaged and superposed to project in an intensified and overcharged manner a virtual complex of relations of power, imaging and narrative. For me, I can see them also as stemming from encounters not only with popular media in text and image, in which she delineates unsuspected conceptual underpinnings, but also encounters with theoretical texts from which she extracts vectors of force and feeling that certainly don't figure in any recognized academic account of the arguments of these texts. So the superposition then of these heterogeneous materials is then projected back into the space of the moving image, at once twisting its form and manifesting within it a kind of speculative futurality, certainly not cleanly outlined as some kind of stark proposition, but shifting and still fringed with the contingencies of the materials and the sometimes jarring sensations that they produce. So these virtualities, which the artist senses, encounters more or less vaguely as consistent and coherent relational continuities across heterogeneous materials, can only be encountered because they impinge subtly on ordinary or conventional perceptions of the world, like the tip of an iceberg. In Deleuze's words, art counts on the contingency of an encounter with that which forces thought. And this thought, even when coaxed with skill, patience, and dedication by the artist back into the fold of the perceptible, is not yet propositional. The encounter is a sensible shard of something alien to recognition, momentarily transfixing the flesh of the actual, and which is used at once as a kind of prism and as a lever. This projection operated by the artwork, although it's futural, does not, or I don't think it does, solicit action or commitment in any straightforward way. That's not to say that art making can't subsequently involve itself in discursive elaboration. But Aliès sums up the relation between saying and seeing, between image and discourse, as involving an irreducibility in principle and relations of force in fact. That is, an in-principle asymmetry or difference, but also a kind of constant negotiation, a politics, compromise, betrayal, forcings, operating between, if you like, the concepts of propositional thought and the ideas of sensation, ideas in the Deleuzian sense. So, to conclude, a guilt or fear, and somehow I felt this in what Diane was saying, about art's insufficient or inadequate relation to theoretical concepts, or to science, or to explicit propositions, I think is misplaced and unfortunate. Instead, we should remember that it has its own resources that have continually enriched and entered into dialogue with discursive thinking according to this tense and asymmetrical relation. And if we reduce the perplexity of the futural space that art opens up to sets of propositions, or posit it as a criteria for art, a kind of propositional explicitness that's foreign to its operations, then we end up with, at best, something like the kind of brittle aesthetic thrills of speculative design and its pseudo-scenario planning, or at worst, a parade of facile and rather colourless utopias.
Thank you. Thanks. Brilliant. Thank you very much all for your contributions. Apologies again for the technical hiccup. Keith, can you hear us, and can we hear you?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
You're not in the image.
Okay.
Uh,
Am I up, or is it too high up?
No, you're up.
Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for presentations. It's sort of, there's a lot of difficult material to sort through, and I thought that the best way that I could pose questions is to sort of think about how this, generates problems for the sort of research trajectory that I've been on, which more recently has kind of been looking at models and modelization within science, and trying to think about how they're understood as technologies of investigation that mediate between a set of abstract theoretical principles and the empirical world. And so for me, it's really been a problem of trying to understand the cognitive processes of art in relation to rational thought and scientific investigation. So to see the construction of artworks as sort of a culturally and institutionally entrenched investigative technologies in the world that have a mediating role and that are partially constrained by both, I guess this transparency and opacity, if you want to take Bassam's use of messenger, rather than being devices of autonomy or freedom from constraints or devices for revolutionary politics, but without, eliminating their political function. And this sort of led me to tracing a certain genealogy of speculative thought within French rationalism, specifically looking at the methodology of Althusser, and more recently its mutation in Francois Laruelle, where you have this sort of a superposition of things that Robin was just referring to. And a sort of significant part of their methodology has to do with how the way in which they managed epistemological obstacles. And this is a kind of, the notion of the epistemological obstacle is something that Althusser takes from Gaston Bachelard, and it seems to me a sort of like unspoken theme of today's symposium is, kind of like, how does art manage its own epistemological obstacles? How would you make art intellectually honest or something like that? And I see this as kind of, it seems related to the problem of art illustrating scientific concepts. Bachelard describes the epistemological obstacle in his book, The Formation of the Scientific Mind, in terms of a sluggishness, disturbance, or inertia that is at the heart of the very act of cognition, and that the problem of scientific knowledge has to be posed in terms of opticals, where there's always an amassing of too many images, metaphors, or analogies that results in a loss of the vector of abstraction that belongs to scientific ideas. So, incidentally, this also seems related to part of the symposium's problem of art illustrating or oversimplifying concepts from science and theory, where there's this disturbance or inertia that's been created for knowledge itself in art's own attempt to construct a relation with knowledge production. So specifically by amassing all of these metaphors and analogies, where the result seems to be that contemporary art itself has become the epistemological obstacle of art in general. So it's producing all this sort of cognitive drain that it claims to be the remedy to. And I wanted to ask Robin about something that he didn't talk about today, but that he brought up at Fernando Zalamea's seminar here in New York when he was speaking about Anne-Francoise Schmid's notion of the integrative object, which I'm wondering if you could talk about that, because it seems if it's insufficient to say that art simply thinks itself because it's thinking alongside or beside other disciplines, if it's a transdisciplinary sort of practice, then wouldn't it be that we can't understand a work of art from within any single discipline, since it's a multimodal form of cognition, and that what it thinks belongs to heterogeneous cultural and temporal strata, so it's appropriating formal and conceptual material that does not inherently belong to art itself. And I'm wondering if this integrative object is a way to consider works of art, and maybe this would be sufficient to thinking about them in a way that isn't where they're not just simply indeterminate multiplicities in the way that Amanda was describing. And since I know that Robin has been reading her work, and he sort of introduced me to it because I wasn't really aware of it before, she also has this idea of non-epistemology, which she's, it's not surprising because Francois Laruelle is her husband, so she's taking this idea of non-philosophy and simply importing it into epistemology. And she talks about non-epistemology as being a sort of, a pure means of projection without aim of the synthetic elements of epistemology onto another dimension. So it's this idea of like importations and exportations of notions and disciplines, which is maybe what Diane was trying to get at with the idea of arts ecology, that it has this transdisciplinary function. But I would also want to ask about this, if this itself is sort of also a way that art generates its epistemological obstacles, because the sort of desire for transdisciplinarity can sort of result in poorly thought, poorly non-conceptualized hybridizations of things, disciplines, ideas, concepts. But something else that Schmidt also brought up was the idea of Bertrand Russell's notion of the hypothesis being a sort of propositional attitude. And I'm wondering if this is a way to think around the sort of disagreement here on proposition, where if you have to think of a work as a proposition, then is this going to specifically abandon its perplexing or problematic character? And isn't it rather that the case that artworks construct problems or forms of hypothesis? And so it's a series of sort of nested propositional attitudes or hypotheses about the world, about concept spaces or forms of subjectivity or possible futures through an active synthesis. And I'm wondering if this could be related to what Robin's saying about maintaining intact the asymmetry between the discursive and the non-discursive. So it's a thinking with rather than about. And if so...
Sorry, may I interrupt you there? Robin, would you maybe like to respond to all these... Okay. Or maybe some of these points.
I would also say, these are general questions that I think I want to put to everybody, but specifically, because I think Robin just was the last to speak, it's sort of, but go ahead.
The answer to questions 1 to 19 is yes. I'm just going to say something very brief about this question of the integrative object. And to be honest, I'm certainly not an expert on Anne-Francois's work, but I did find it very interesting, and I did find that as soon as I read it, I thought it had an applicability to contemporary art, because the notion of the integrative object comes from her work in scientific epistemology, where it's clear that many of the objects that are at the forefront of science no longer belong to any one discipline, and many of them don't fit into a historical vision of science or an epistemological model of how science works, where you have a kind of strata of different sciences which eventually kind of rest upon physics. So it doesn't really, some of these objects just don't seem to work in that way, and the fact that models are often used in dealing with these objects is also a large part of that. But so, for instance, the one she's worked with many scientists in collaboration, and one of the examples she always uses is genetically modified fish, which belongs to the commercial sphere, the economic sphere, microbiology, genetics, etc. So it's a kind of overlapping of all these different fields. And the way in which she describes the concept of the integrative object is that it's an attempt to save a kernel of the real. So it's not that this object is simply the sum of all of the narratives about it. There is a kernel of the kernel of real of this object, as in non-philosophy, but it's a kind of a black hole. It's the kind of the place where each of these disciplines can no longer grasp what the object is. So the object is a kind of a space in between all of the different disciplines that try to describe it, and each description of it is in effect a kind of model or a fiction. And it immediately struck me that certainly a lot of the artists who I've worked with and who I find interesting are dealing with objects that are like this. In fact, you could say that this is what the contemporary object is. The objects that we find very disturbing and difficult to define, and which don't fit into any kind of recognized category, they are integrative objects. So the contemporary, in a sense, is integrative. But then I think a lot of the objects that artists produce are also these kinds of objects that don't fit into, if you like, a kind of modernist division of labour of the fields of art or the media of art.
Should we go to see if there's...
Well, I was actually going to suggest that Suhail, who was mentioned very many times, I was wondering if we could have a little bit of a response from you in London as well, before we move on to the audience here.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a response. I know Keith had some general questions, but I'll maybe give an initial response, and then do you want to take questions from people here as well? We have about 25 people here.
Wow, that's great. That would be very lovely. But what we were thinking was to take turns with the questions. I might ask a question first here, and then go back to you.
Okay.
In London.
I'll do an initial question then, which kind of takes this from another angle than Keith. So Keith is interested in the epistemologies that can be constructed around the artwork and sort of the way in which contemporary models fail or could contribute to revised notions of epistemology. But the thing that struck me across many of the presentations was actually the opposite issue around pragmatics. And I think this is partly tied into the distinction that Amanda initially made between sapience and sentience from Brandon. So pragmatics, I guess let me kind of take it. This is partly just to kind of sharpen the differences between the presentations, and to kind of throw the cat amongst the pigeons in Newcastle. So it seems like one of the things that Diane was talking about was the way in which other disciplines or other kind of practices than art produce objective knowledges. And in a way, what she was asking for was this sort of reveal function, which I thought was exactly what Amanda was criticizing as a kind of false myth of contemporary art. So I'd be interested to hear where Amanda, I mean, in some ways, like they're very close, because I think Amanda is saying that contemporary art is on the art model that she describes, which is the kind of critical reflexive model, is a false mission, because in a way the real that it posits as its purpose or its mission is unavailable to it, and what's needed, as I understood it, was a much more kind of pragmatic operation of the artwork. And I think Diane is also somewhere asking for a pragmatic operation of the artwork as it happens through other disciplines. So with science in particular, but also engineering was mentioned at one point, and so on. So there's a similarity in the interest in pragmatics, but at the same time, Diane's interest is around the kind of the reveal moment of a true knowledge, which Amanda is saying art wrongly looks for. And for Bassam, around the transparency, opacity thing, it seemed to me that one redescription of transparency, as Metzinger proposes it, is sapience, right? So the animal is sapient, or in our kind of daily interactions, or it's a kind of Heideggerian designing, we're sapient. We're not necessarily sentient because we're not self-reflecting upon what we're doing, right? Which is what Metzinger has called transparency as a kind of usual operation, but it's not Homo sapiens sapiens. So sentience then belongs to the condition of self-reflexivity, but that's also the thing that Amanda is criticizing as contemporary art in its kind of standard model. So in a way, I think Amanda's model, or Amanda's characterization as contemporary art, tries to do a reveal of a truth, of an epistemology, or a kind of an ontological, substructure of a kind of false illusory reality that or false illusion that we commonly inhabit. This ends up, one, is the wrong premise, but secondly, what you end up with is a kind of self-reflexive and self-referential art, which just gets caught up in its own contortions and actually doesn't allow art to act, to be pragmatic. So there's something about the the construction which would map the wish that Amanda is expressing to be much more like a pragmatic operation or a sapience rather than sentience. So there seems to me like an implicit interest in certainly in Diane and Bassam's response around, and I couldn't quite tell with Bassam whether there was an interest in pragmatics as the response to the condition you're describing, or whether it's an interest in sentience, which should not be pragmatic in that sense, and where that would leave you in respect of Amanda's kind of initial construction. For Robin, in these formulations, it seems to me that, in a way, yes, the mistake would be to kind of turn the propositional directly into simply conceptual tasks, right? And I mean, I think Robin's presentation is of course highly Deleuzian and relies a lot on the what is philosophy thesis between different philosophy deals with concepts, art deals with perception, and science deals with what does science deal with? I can't remember. It deals with something else. I can't remember. But there's a kind of threefold distinction. And it seems to me that it's certainly the case that what Robin's emphasizing in the parable is a distinction between what can be gleaned through the senses sensorially against a kind of ratiocinative epistemological production. But it's nonetheless the case that what Delacroix does and what Robin seems to be asking for in this kind of Deleuzian model was something like an effectivity from within the complex of the art field, which is both conceptual and sensorial or perceptual. So my question is really around how Amanda responds to her co-panelists in relationship to this to pragmatics, and whether the art she's interested in is more pragmatic than the art that she's criticizing.
Okay.
And also, I guess for the other panelists, where they would sit around the notion of pragmatics in relationship to Amanda's proposition.
Amanda, would you like to respond to that question?
I would. I'm very keen that we have time for questions if there are burning questions from here without avoiding that. But should I say something very quickly? Mm-hmm. Should I do that, and then maybe you could say things about pragmatism or pragmatics? I'm fascinated by this idea. I mean, this is like a thought that I've, of course, been having and trying to talk about today, that how art has claimed its, let's say, sentience or its thought power is through the reveal of itself, its self-explication. And I've described that, if you like, with the help of Brandon, even though I don't agree with all of Brandon's stuff or anything, but I just find it helpful because what Brandon does is he allows us to think of a hierarchy of propositional and representational languages. So every propositional language in Brandon has representational qualities, and every representational language has propositional qualities. There's no real sense that they don't, they're not divorced from each other, but nevertheless there are detectable hierarchies, and I'm not quite sure how to think that anyway. I need to think more about that, but I'm kind of claiming that the sentience that's claimed by art, this thinking art, the display of a thinking art that thinks itself, for me is let's say minimally sentient. It's the bare minimum of it, if you like, if I can say that. It's only because it's only able to talk about itself, so it can't exist beyond that. And so I mean, maybe I'm going off point, but I'll just say, when Robin was talking about a propositional art as an art that would want to solicit a kind of response from the viewer, solicit commitment from the viewer. To be honest, when I think of, let's say, my conditions for proposition and representation, you know, I wouldn't presume. I mean, my critique is that what's claimed as propositional art is wrong to divest or assume it can divest itself of representationalism and those format, those non-discursive formats, right? So for me, the thought of propositional content in an artwork is an art that's committed, right? Not to solicit commitment in a viewer. Now that might be not ambitious, or you could say, well, that's not.
Does it matter to what?
Sorry?
An art that's committed doesn't matter.
Well, I could tell you what my art's committed to.
No,
right,
I
that's
know,
easy.
but I mean, like, but there seems like an important, like, I mean, that,
I won't
you know,
presume
you can take that in any number of directions, right? I mean,
but
like that.
When I say an art that's committed, I don't mean that sounds like being put away, but but I mean when I talk about a committed art, first of all, I'm not talking about Adorno, obviously, but I'm talking about and I know it's unfashionable to talk about a committed practice, but I'm thinking that in terms of Brandon, like really simply, is that he talks about something that has propositional content, having been able to infer relations, and so and those inferences that you make reach out beyond you, if you like, and they take you maybe on paths that you might not know where you'll end up. And I think that feels to me like being in the studio. It seems like a really nice description of being in the studio and making art. And I think that that kind of committed art is committed to following through on the inferences of the practice. So without it being a kind of set of regressive tautological problems, or this idea that my task is to explicate or make explicit certain cognitive understandings of the conditions of my own thinking, right? So that's what I'm opposed to. Instead, I'm trying to think, well, if we can use that word propositional, and we can think about it pragmatically as like, I'm committed to this, where does that take me? I might not know, but the word projection is something I've been writing about, and I've used that as a kind of idea of where does the work project into, and that's the commitment, if you like, by the artist. So the commitment for me isn't wanting an audience to commit to the work. So I just want to be clear about that. And I'm going to stop talking, and maybe there's a question.
Probably open to the audience. Just wondering, Keith, can you hear me on this microphone still, since we've had this technical issue?
Yes.
Are there any questions here? Just very briefly.
Any questions from the audience?
All right. I can't see very clearly, so make it on.
Great.
Test. Is this working?
It's working, yes.
Okay. So I wanted to take things back a bit to talking about a rationalist art practice, and also try and link that with the stuff about commitment and what we're committed to that you were just raising there. So, I mean, as I see it, if we commit to being rational, that is, you know, we take an interest in that which is perennially interested in us, i.e. reason, and it's in a sort of Hegelian or Brandonian sense, then to me this implies, first of all, that the practice is a universalism, not in the sort of false sense of contemporary art where it's universal only insofar as it can elicit an individual response in anyone. But also, if we add to that commitment, a commitment to a systematic emancipatory politics that would be in line with the artistic practice, and the sort of ethical summum bonum, to use Reza Negrestani's term, then all those things together, which I still take as being fairly sort of minimal, implies to me that the project of inhumanism is really the sort of single supreme artwork to which we're committed to. That is, you know, construction of, say, Brandonian artificial intelligence, which could then meet all our future intellectual demands, you know, yeah, forever, basically. So my provocation is that, you know, if we're thinking a rationalist universal art practice, what is that if not commitment to the inhuman in Negrostani's sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Can I just add something to that? I'm kind of trying to digest what you were saying about commitment. I'm not sure.
Before you answer, could somebody just paraphrase the question? We didn't hear it very well.
Is commitment to art necessarily a commitment to Negrostanian inhumanism? Is that a good paraphrase? It's a succinct version. In order for art to be committed, is that?
I mean, if we're committing to to rationality, then we're committing to a universalism, as I see it. If we're committing to rationality on the sort of Brandonian view, so that's a kind of universalism, both at the level of different discourses, so art, science, and so on, in that they'd be undergirded by the same rational foundation, and universalism at the level of societies, individuals, and so on.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Do you people from the panel, would you maybe like to respond to the question?
Sorry, that's...
You can.
I was just going to say, I understood what you were saying about this. That's very interesting. This transposition of the idea of the kind of Brandonian cycle of commitments and into your feeling of what you're doing in the studio and what your practice involves. But then I can't really understand what the content of you're saying you want to be a committed artist is, because it seems to just be a good artist is a committed artist because they're committed to doing their art. So therefore, I'm kind of linking this to the question, saying, well, isn't there something else you have to be committed to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can say that the commitment that, it's really annoying because all I can do is say, in my work, you know, like this kind of very personal response, but I have been trying for a long time to think about what a realist artistic practice could be, and when I talk about other art practices, which I've done a little bit today, but we could do that more, but I recognize them to be anti-realist in character, and practices that have attempted to be realist, materialist have often produced a certain, they've fallen into kind of idealist formations of practice. And so I think that, of course, trying to have a realist practice is not something new, right? Fair enough, that's not a problem for me, but it still begs the question of what that would be. So the commitment really is that simple to me. What is realist art? Can there be one? How would that be explored? And is it, rather than a question of aesthetics, is it a question of method, behavior, attitude, certain other conditions that one has to think through in practice? So essentially the commitment to me, and this is where the Brandon is kind of interesting, because there's as I started off saying, how art thinks in the how it is, if you like, and then how art ought to think. And you know, there's a commitment to the ought. Mm-hmm. Like how are things and how should things be? And you could say that I could conflate that if I'm in realist terms, because how things ought to be is how they are in a sense, but they're not how we might experience them empirically, right? So to understand the conditions of a pursuit of a realism in practice has to understand both the empirical, how things are, and the ought in a lived sensibility. And Robin was very nicely referring to some of my work, and I think that's a brilliant, great description of, for me, those things operating together. So in montage, if you like.
Right.
So to me, I know I'm not really going straight to your question, but for me, that the ought is the point of the commitment to realism. And I would say, because I'm making that in my work, because that's my project, of course everyone else should be thinking it too, right? Why not? Because that's right. Okay? I'm not just some little going, oh, I think I'm making this artificial, weak, little me suggesting this is how might think. No, it's how they ought to be, right? And that's the commitment, and everyone else should be doing it too.
Can I open this to, I see Ruth in FILET. Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Do you have a question from FILET?
Yes. I have my own question to Amanda, and I want to ask you, Amanda, if you understand your pedagogical practice as part of your artwork.
No.
You don't?
No. No.
Okay.
Just a great job.
Maybe you can go a bit further. Why don't you understand your pedagogical practice as part of your artwork? What is the difference?
Well, there's different responses to that. First of all, I don't teach my work, right? So there's not that connection. I think it's really boring to teach what I write and what I do, and it feels too not narcissistic and strange. However, one thing that I'm very interested in is how we assess students, and a lot when I was a student, and one of the categories that we assess on is self-reflexive criticality, and that's usually in a box, and we have to do a tick saying very self-reflexive. And often students who get high marks for self-reflexivity get distinctions, either at undergrad or grad level, and I'm very concerned about how we identify and recognize that quality in artwork. What does that even mean? So pedagogically, at a structural level, yes, but at an intimate level, kind of no, if that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Diane wanted to say.
Well, no, well, it depends. I mean, I think I don't have like a regular teaching gig, and I think if I did, I might feel differently about it. But I have done. Suhail and I actually taught well, to say taught is not really fair. In a way, it ended up being a workshop that we initiated at a space in Miami called Cannonball, which ended up being much more a collaborative project in terms of thinking what the city is, how art and artists can not just be subject to the forces of capital within urban planning and within a city, and how they can actually flip and take their position as a position of power and rethink the city and art's relationship to it. So I mean, in a way, that felt very close to what I'm interested in doing in my practice. Now, it's not this thing that you said. It was very much not this teaching my practice, like teaching people how to make work like I make. It was very much, I mean, it was a very privileged position there too, because we had these people, and this is where this collaboration with these architects started. I mean, you had like professional people coming in you could very much collaborate with, and it was fantastic. And so I think there are spaces where pedagogy can very much be part of practice. If it is just teaching people how to be like mini-me's, then no, of course. But I think there is a space for that.
I'm wondering, because I know that Bassam didn't get to respond to the last one, what Bassam might think about this, because he teaches at the Dutch Art Institute.
Actually, just seeing that he's just disappeared.
Tony.
Tony?
Yes, I'm here. I lost his video, but I'm wondering if he's still there.
Or maybe we can come back to him.
I'll bring him on, hold on, and then we'll come back to him. Maybe we can take one more question from the audience.
This does seem to still be something to address this question about pedagogy, because from what you said about commitment, it seemed like it necessarily implied a normative dimension. So therefore, were you teaching on that level, then surely you would be trying to create mini-me's. You would be saying, this is what we should be doing. If the commitment is that the kind of thematic thrust of your work is what's important and what we should be doing, doesn't that make it kind
well,
of
I think actually, in terms of, for me, it's not about teaching. I teach according to trying to think about students having rigor, right? So that's key to that thinking that I'm talking about, this idea of thinking clearly.
Yeah.
And I think that that for me gets there in that sense, but having really in-depth discussions with faculty about the conditions of pedagogy, the structure of it, how we assess, these are all like really long-term issues that I think have been really great things to work on, because they're the bits where the students begin to see the conditions change. Because in that criteria for assessment, that's the institution speaking. And I think that it's not as simple. I mean, it is people in individual cases, but it's also, it needs to be a kind of rethinking of the institutional language that we operate with, but also understanding what we mean by it. So that's really been a kind of project, not just with me, but I have a fantastic time at Cal Arts because a lot of my faculty are interested in this too, and I'm co-teaching a class right now with Christine Wertheim where we're actually talking about this a lot. These things come up, like these conditions of being cognizant of terms, operations and context. So
I was just imagining that in your own practice and in taking up this committed position, maybe this brings in the question of universalism again, is like maybe you come up against the same, well, I know that you do because I've seen conversations like this, that you come up against this response of you know, how dare you universalize and say this is what's important and what you should be doing. I like doing my art, this is what I'm interested in. And so I don't know, maybe that kind of,
I feel like we're diverging a little bit from
yeah,
this relationship.
I was just going to bring it back to this question of that Diane raised about the kind of community of artists rather than it being about one artist, and whether you see that kind of you know, this kind of commitment as having to be a collective thing rather than an individual thing.
I'm finding it much more useful to work collaboratively now. I mean, in terms of thinking, in terms of production of knowledge, I think there's still space for individual artworks for sure. And in a way, I do think I mean, as I said, I think the kind of thinking between these things is different. I mean, I think there's time to be spent in the studio and, you know, you're trying to figure out what the hell you're doing and trying to work on what is exciting and urgent. But I do think there's also a need to, in a way, sort of take the reins a bit. I sort of feel like artists are sort of end up in this role of as being like subject to the forces around them, and I think we're sort of at a point where actually that seems it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. I mean, like, we are thinking agents. We can contribute and actually make what this ecology is, and I think doing that through collaborative means can be very productive, not necessarily exclusively. I think actually this description you gave of what an artwork, how it wasn't really how it functions, but where you sort of came to at the end was really convincing, and it was one of these moments of like, oh yeah, that's what it's supposed to do, but it's not, that doesn't happen all that often, unfortunately. When it does, it's great.
But isn't it also unpredictable?
What? Of course, yeah, for sure. I mean, whether you come up with that or not.
Right.
Yeah,
which would
for
make
sure.
it impossible to ask for commitment in advance because. Okay.
Pardon? We have. I'm just sorry to interrupt, but we have Bassam on with us, and he has 10 more minutes left before he has to go. So if we want him to respond to something, he can maybe respond to one last question.
Amanda, you wanted to ask him a question.
Well, no, I was just wondering, Bassam has heard, hopefully, some of the questions from the audience, and I just wanted to give him the opportunity to respond to anything we've been talking about, really, rather than ask him something very specific.
You're on mute.
We can't hear him.
Unmute.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. No, I don't really have a response. I thought Suhail's kind of roundup of sapience and sentience and its relationship to transparency and, and opacity, and then his comment about Robin's ideas in their kind of like Deleuzian lineage, if you like, in relationship to kind of epistemological stance, I think was very interesting. But and I think I want to kind of develop something that actually elaborates on where I think the connections are, but I don't quite have the words at the moment.
Maybe I can ask you a very specific question then. Yeah, I was curious. You were mentioning the Champion as maximum opacity. I was wondering if you would be able to elaborate on that a little bit more specifically.
Well, the thing is, I think where Suhail's kind of comments actually meet are in the question of composition, and actually that's where I think the kind of historical reading or art historical reading of art as something that is only made only becomes known to us as art through actually splintering itself off from a kind of a craftsmanship or a basic idea of labor, which is transparent or unintellectual, if you like. It becomes this is when composition arises, or the concept of composition. And this is actually where What is Philosophy, the book by Deleuze and Guattari, they make a distinction between, I mean, they say art is basically composition. Anything that wants to be called art is composition, but they make a distinction between technical composition, which they don't think counts as art, and technical composition here is the idea of basically kind of like the artisanal, but they also say it's materialistic in the sense that it's related to the science of making the material and so on. And then they say there's an art, there's a composition that is not about technicality, but about the sensory. For me, it comes back to the point that Suhail was talking about, and that Amanda also mentioned, this idea of revealing. So revealing is only at the level of the conceptual, if you like. It's only at the level of the opaque, which is the sentient, and not at the level of the material. And this is, I think, quite kind of problematic, because in that sense, it kind of creates this situation where what you want to reveal is always related to the material. It's always related to something that you can't access. And I think Amanda, in a talk recently in Beirut that she gave, she used this terminology of administering rather than revealing. I think I thought was really interesting. This idea of administrating images, administering reality in a sense, rather than revealing, the drive towards the kind of administration rather than the drive towards an uncovering, if you like. And I thought that's that kind of administration can really actually only be achieved if we kind of create this situation where reality is seen both as sapient and sentient, rather than as something that is either or. And that is the kind of brings us back to Metzinger, which is where he says where he creates this relationship between a transparency and opacity. So for me, to answer Sohail's previous question, it's administrationism and the administration of the image, as Amanda kind of, and I agree with her, I think this is probably the most interesting position, can only come from a kind of a non-ideal sense of reality, which is basically the admission that art can only function through art as we know it. The terminology of art comes from its splintering from the artisanal, and because of that it has to function at the level of the sentient, but the level of the sentient should be combined with the level of the sapient, which is a kind of the idea of transparency. So I think that's a kind of quick explanation that I hope makes a little bit of sense.
Thank you very much for that. I would like to just ask there's one final question from FILET to close up, because I'm quite conscious of the time. So if there is one last question from FILET, it would be great to have it. If not, then I think this might be a good time to call it this talk to a close. Thank you all so much for participating. Can we actually maybe see the people at FILET? Can you spin the computer around? Brilliant.
Audience, meet audience.
Meet the audience. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience.